Hi, good afternoon. We didn't plan this, but I'm quite glad that Chung did quite a hard sell on logistics. He did a deep dive on Gemodebt. So we do have another proposition for you in terms of investing in manufacturing in FDI, which is logistic fund. So, so when I think about the VinaCapital logistic funds, I think it shows the evolution of VinaCapital when we address a certain demand in the market. So when we spot an opportunity or a certain gap in the market for a certain asset class, what we usually do is we team up with a team that is best in the sector. We'll bring that know-how to Vietnam, and then we develop the strategic partnership. And that's why we have a partnership together with AP Moller Capital for the logistic platform. So before we delve into all the details, let me just quickly introduce myself, and I'll let the team introduce themselves as well. So my name is Hai Le, and I co-head the Vietnam Logistic Growth Fund at VinaCapital. I'm a banker by background. I spent 16 years in London in various different fund parts of investment banking. I returned to Vietnam in 2023, and I joined VinaCap earlier this year to co-head the platform. Let me pass you on to Mike to introduce himself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hai. Michael Rasmussen, as the screen says. Next year will be, I'm Danish. Next year will be 40 years in transport, shipping, and logistics, of which the majority of those years have actually been in Vietnam. So a very nice place to be when we talk infrastructure developments and the need for pushing on with that. I'm very happy and very proud to be working with these two great colleagues of mine. I have another colleague sitting at the back of the room who are here today from Singapore. And Leon, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Leon Santos. I'm Australian, but I've been very proud and excited to be in Vietnam for the last 6 years. I've been a private equity funds lawyer most of my life, spending time in London and Singapore before here, so working with global sponsors and M&A transactions. I'm very fortunate to be co-leading the logistics fund with this handsome gentleman, Hai, and also working with our partners at AP Moller. We have a co-investment structure here, so AP Moller is our logistics, global logistics expertise partner. And I wanted to start just by thanking, first of all, thank you to Michael Burnett for flying over from Singapore, AP Moller's representative in the region, as well as Michael. And thank you all for staying, but also thank you for taking time out of your investing lives to be with us here in Vietnam. We know you have busy schedules, but the way we look at it, Vietnam needs us. Vietnam needs our capital, and it needs our ideas, so it means a lot to us. And finally, work product here today is not just from Hai, myself, and Michael. So we were supported by a large research team, and thank you especially to Mr. Young and Felix, our intern, who worked tirelessly on this project. So back to you, Hai.
Thank you, Leon. I think when I think about the central theme of our fund, what we're trying to do is really to create a platform to address the infrastructure gap in Vietnam. So what happens is McKinsey estimated between now and 2030, there would be a requirement of investing about $130 billion worth of capex into investment for the infrastructure to catch up with the growth of the economy and of trade volume. The government so far has announced about $120 billion or shy of $120 billion worth of investment. So that leaves a gap of more than $10 billion to be addressed. And this is where we think that private capital will have a really big role to play. And that's where we step in. So throughout today, you've listened a lot about the Vietnam macro story, so I'm not going to repeat those points again. But what I'll do is I will point out some of the most relevant theme for logistics. So let's start with the fundamentals. So you've heard that Vietnam is a trade-driven economy, right? Just to put that in perspective, our trade volume is roughly 2 times the size of our GDP, right? And where does that come from? That comes from a lot of foreign direct investment. So FDI has been increased over 7-fold in the last 20 years. And what that does is 2 things. One is the volume of import-export, and second is that it helps build a really strong domestic economy. Thirdly, you've heard about the labor market here. So 52 million people, young, skilled workers, with the cost of roughly today, probably about a third compared to China. And then finally, Don this morning mentioned about the bamboo diplomacy, which has created an environment really conducive for trade. So Vietnam is one of the countries that has the highest number of FTAs in the region. So why are we excited about logistics? So that comes down to the 3 catalysts here. The first one is, despite all of that demand or crying out for logistics, logistic costs in Vietnam is still relatively high compared to the neighboring countries. So the government has been spending. So amongst the ASEAN nations, Vietnam spent about 6% of the GDP on infrastructure, but that still doesn't address the whole gap of infrastructure investment in Vietnam. That's where there's a $10 billion gap still remains in order for that infrastructure to catch up with the economy. And this is where our private capital platform will come in. And the reason why we're excited, because we think we have a very differentiated investment strategy in order for you to play in this market. So let me tell you a bit more about that strategy. We identified 3 major platforms in logistics: airports, seaport, and land-based logistics. And there is a common denominator across all of them. And the common thread here is that we are investing in operating businesses with real hard assets that will form part of that critical infrastructure in Vietnam. So if I try to deconstruct kind of the philosophy behind this, it's really simple. So we start with the core, the fundamental, which is we have an infrastructure asset. This is a defensive asset with stable cash flow. You build the first layer, which is the growth of Vietnam. So infrastructure and logistic growth in Vietnam outpace the same in other developed markets. Then the second layer, which is logistics. So this is where the value add will come in to create that additional return for investor. And then finally, because of all of the components I've mentioned, then these projects are highly bankable, right? So from that perspective, once you build that package with the foundation, with the growth, with the logistic and the financing, we think we have a very attractive proposition for investors. We're going to delve into each one of these segments, but before that, I'll pass you over to Leon to talk about the fund.
So how do we access these opportunities? Essentially, we have 2 big advantages that we think sets us apart. One is VinaCapital's 20-year track record in Vietnam. So we've invested, as you see here, $6 billion into Vietnam. A lot of that has been into hard assets. We've invested really across the spectrum: industrial property, social infrastructure in hospitals through our private equity fund, residential, commercial opportunities. So we know how to, and we've built the networks to source proprietary transactions. The other thing is exits. In an illiquid market, a small market like Vietnam, investors often ask about exits. Our private equity strategy, the VinaCapital Vietnam Opportunity Fund alone has delivered 50 full exits since 2003. We think that's the most of any financial investor in Vietnam. And the second advantage is our partnership with AP Moller. So AP Moller Capital was born out of one of the world's biggest companies. They have the brand name AP Moller Maersk, and they've been doing for over 100 years shipping, transport logistics, now renewable energy, and in many other areas connected to supply chain management. They've invested globally. especially in hard assets, and they have also invested in emerging markets for many years. You'll see that together we want to invest 350 million via a platform, a co-investment platform, and VinaCapital is raising a fund of 150 million to add into that 350. You might ask why it's so small. Well, that reflects the deal sizes in Vietnam. We are looking at growth assets. We're not similar to some of the larger infrastructure funds which invest billions of dollars. These are high growing assets.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to the previous two speakers for creating a good segue into what I am here to tell you a little bit about, and that's seaport development in Vietnam. It's a sector that has been undergoing tremendous transformation over the past 18 to 20 years. If we turn back time, volumes, and we are anticipating, as you can see on the screen, we are anticipating about 24, 25 million TEUs this year, spread over the entire country. The distribution you see in the second column, but 20 years ago that number was 5, 6 million TEUs. And what was interesting back then was that Vietnam was serviced exclusively by small feeder ships, connecting to transshipment hub ports in Southeast Asia, mainly Singapore, Port Kelang, but also Hong Kong, Taiwan, and later on South China. It was a time-consuming and expensive setup, and the government decided, of course, in order to really truly play ball in a serious way and to be able to create a well-functioning, efficient value chain for importers and exporters, they needed to invest in deeper sea seaports. That began to happen in the early 2000s. And some of you here in the room will probably recall that Cam Ep Chi Vai was the first place that saw a true deep sea port being inaugurated. Despite that, we are today seeing more than 60% of all containerized freight volumes still moving in and out of river ports and upstream facilities. That in itself gives an idea as to, in one way, how far we have gotten. Actually, in fact, that we do sport now deep sea ports, but there's still a significant part of the cargo that is relying on smaller facilities, to some extent more inefficient facilities upstream. So there's a lot that still has to be done, both in the north and in the south, as far as building out the deep sea port facilities. We have, throughout the day today, heard from Mike, I think, from Michael starting in the morning, and also other speakers, as to how good 2024 has been relative to trading and trade with predominantly North America. That is also reflected in the containerized volumes. We have seen, on the back of a lackluster 2023, we have seen very solid volumes in 2024. Based on Michael's, him hinting that maybe next year we have to manage expectations, it will be very interesting to see where they ring in 2025. We have seen a net 20% growth year to date, first 8 months, 2024 versus 2023. That's a very solid figure. Again, on the back of a not so exciting 2023. To create a little bit of perspective, back to when I mentioned that we need to see continuous investments in port infrastructure, and in particular the deep sea port infrastructure. Cam Ep Chi Vai still is only about 40% of all volume flowing in and out of South Vietnam. Cam Ep Chi Vai grew at twice as much as Ho Chi Minh City grew year to date. if we take that growth number, and there are various reasons for that, and for me to go too deeply into that, I will be running out of time. But it's important to keep in mind that if we continue to see the same growth, we will need to add almost one new terminal in Kaimyarchivai a year. That is equivalent of 1.4 million TEUs a year net growth. We expect Kaimyarchivai will handle about 7 million TEUs in 2024. And if you consider that it takes from planning, permits, execution to commercial opening, best case 3.5 to 4 years, we better get busy. We have mentioned up here that there are no new ports planned, and that's the case for the southern part of Vietnam, for Kaimyarchivai and upstream river facilities in Ho Chi Minh City. There is some port planning going on in Lac Nguyen in North Vietnam, opposite Hai Phong. And we are seeing 2 projects being executed now. There is a longer pipeline, there's a longer intention, port master plan-wise, to build out that facility. But you're building further and further into the bay in Hai Phong, and there will be increasingly more expensive projects to execute. So we believe we together here, we have something to address and something to help Vietnam with, and the importers and exporters of Vietnam, and that is to progress this, this build-out of deep-sea port infrastructure and adjacent logistics, which so far has not really been done yet sufficiently comparing to other countries. So what we ideally like to do is to build an ecosystem around a seaport or an airport, and then see that prosper and provide a fuller ecosystem, a fuller package to the cargo owners, whether that be import or export. I think it's also important to keep in mind that it is a very complex sector. You have a lot of players involved. You have a lot of not always complementary interests. And that is what we're also up against. And it's a challenge. It will continue to be a challenge for the government to try to regulate that and try to ensure that all the investors, whether that be local, for instance, Yamadeb as an example, or people like ourselves in unity with other local developers. It's also an industry that is, when it comes to containerization, has also foreign ownership limits. We are up against typically a 49% max foreign ownership limit here. So we have to sit down with local partners and to make sure we find the right projects that we together can develop. Maybe Q&A while we have these 3, maybe if there's any Q&A now relative to container ports or deep sea facilities, seaports. If there's any Q&A now, happy to entertain those, or any questions. Great. Moving on.
Let's move on.
The next subsector that we've carved out is land-based logistics. What we're talking about here is warehousing. But there's some specific trends and particular detail to cover here. So what you'll see on the left is really a lot of capacity coming online, doubling 2019, more than doubling 2019 to 2024, 14% per annum growth projected over the next few years. There's been a lot of activity from industrial landlords like BWI, Mapletree. Those comprise the 47%, so incredibly consolidated in the industrial park sector. This is landlord-based business. Similar with cold storage, there are now over 100 cold storage operators, so an incredible amount of investment. The point we want to make here is, I just want to talk through a little bit about hinterland connectivity, price, and also scarcity of assets. What we are seeing is that in Vietnam, there is a incredible competition already for strategically located sites in good areas like Dong Nai and Binh You. The reason for that is hinterland connectivity. If you read about infrastructure in Vietnam, you will very quickly see that the government is spending 6% of GDP, that's about $26 billion a year, one of the highest rates in the ASEAN region, improving that connectivity. They're building roads, they're building airports, there's plans for high-speed rail. All of it needs to be improved. And while that is improving, there's still a lot of assets that are not properly connected. So what you will find is delays moving shipment of goods from seaports into the cities, to factories, to inland depots, and then on to end consumers. You will hear about delays at borders, things like that. So the government is trying to address that, but there's a lot of opportunity here for the private sector as well to come in. One of the points we'd like to make here is about sustained FDI and value-add services. So in our fund, we don't want to play in the industrial park sector. That's incredibly consolidated. That's landlord business. What we want to do is more along supply chain logistics. This is where the value add really exists. So I'll give you an example. We would invest in a local company that buys land assets and then leases them to a 3PL like DHL or DB Schenker. We would provide the land, we would find the staff, we would build the systems and operations, the packaging and sorting. And this is where really, this is what we call logistics. That's where the value add exists. So value add is an extremely important part of our strategy. We're very different to the BWIs and the maple trees. That's not what we want to do. And in this space, it's still relatively fragmented. You do see some local champions. The last presentation mentions Gemadep. There are also companies like Transamex, ITL, homegrown companies here, and a long list of others operating in this space, but it remains fragmented. So that's really where we want to play. And you might ask, why don't the 3PLs do it themselves? Well, the first is they don't always want to take on the capital cost in a lot of emerging markets. And the second is they don't want to take on the complexity of finding staff, building systems, and solving all those issues that are local to Vietnam. And that's really where our two advantages come into play. You need a local partner like VinaCapital, who has experience in investing in, sourcing, and developing local teams. And you also need logistics expertise, which comes from AP Moller's many, many years of global experience in the area to really provide the efficiencies and to provide the best-in-class facilities. Back to you, Hai.
Thank you, Leon. So, last but not least, airport logistics. So, unlike the other two sectors, this is a heavily consolidated sector. So, in any part of the value chain of airport logistics, you can count the number of participants on one hand. It is a sector that caters for high-value goods. So, air cargo takes up probably about less than 1% of the volume of goods in Vietnam, but it's about 25% of the value, right? So when you think about it, you really think about kind of how Vietnam manufacturing has been moving up that value chain from textile, from garments, from agricultural product to electronics, semiconductor, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where we play. So talking about growth, up until COVID, the sector has gone through more than 8% of growth. A lot of that is driven by, manufacturing players like Samsung, like Foxconn, LG coming into Vietnam. During COVID time, there's a bit of volume decline, right? A lot of that is to do with the initial COVID timing, bounced back significantly, but then faced the disruptive economy macro outlook in Vietnam and the Russia-Ukraine war, etc. But what's interesting here is during that COVID years, there is a divergence between the North and the South, and I'll talk to you more about it. But going forward, significant growth is expected in the sector, and as I said, it's driven by that high-value products that are coming out of Vietnam. And this is coming in from people like we call them sort of the manufacturing queen bees, right? The Samsung and the Foxconn of the world. In terms of the sector dynamics, so first of all, capacity constraint. I'm sure if you kind of fly in from overseas, you've been through Tân Sơn Nhất or Nội Bài, you can see how congested they are, right? So the government here, so like taking your example, earlier this year, so electronics volume this year, so far for the first 8 months has increased about 25%. And that means all of the air cargo terminals have been sold out completely, right? So the government is putting in money, right? So you're gonna see, hopefully before the April next year, you're going to see the Terminal 3 at Tân Sơn Nhất. There's a project going on for Terminal 2, right, expansion in Nội Bài, and Long Thanh Airport is on the way as well. I've talked about the regional differences, and this is where during COVID time, we see the South suffered from a volume perspective, but the North, Nội Bài, has kept steady. So they still maintain about 4% growth during COVID time. And that is driven by that electronic manufacturing cluster around the Bắc Ninh and Bắc Giang area. The value chain is incredibly important as Vietnam keep moving up that curve in the value chain. We expect that's going to continue to drive the air cargo volume. And finally, from an airline perspective, so the customers are airlines. And this is a heavily regulated industry. So hence the relationship, the customer relationship are typically long and they're sticky. So the way that we look at airport logistics is we like the growth, we like the fundamental, which is the electronics value chain that Vietnam is playing, and finally the barrier to entry because of the highly regulated and because of the long and sticky customer relationship. So hopefully you've now see kind of all the three segments of why we choose them. We think from our perspective, we see a lot of opportunities of investing in logistics in Vietnam, right? Backed by strong fundamentals. We think we have a very strong platform with our partner, AP Moller, who brings in the unmatched sector expertise and their track record in investing in logistics elsewhere in the world. So hopefully you are excited as we are about the platform. We're happy to take any question now or later on as well. So.
Can you hear me? Yeah. What are the main hurdles to success in the logistics sector? Maybe I'm thinking more regulatory. Maybe you can touch on other points as well.
Do you want to start, Michael?
Regulatory?
Yes.
I was alluding to it before, the 49% ownership, maximum foreign ownership. Hai just mentioned it relative to airports, which is even tighter. We're also bound often, to some extent at least, dictated by port master plans. We are sometimes also up against local governments who are not always at provincial level in unity relative to where we should go. There is always not a clear roadmap as to what needs to be built when. Some 15, 18 years ago, there was too big of a capacity injection in the southern part of Vietnam, which meant that the operators suffered for years because simply capacity was built way too fast. And there's also another, which we are beginning to see less of, however, but there's also let's say, to invite too many to the party. So supply and demand is always important in any market, and that's something which I think today Vietnam has generally a better understanding for at government level, at regulatory level. And then I think it's back to location, and it's back to what we commercially can offer the importers and exporters and beyond in the local business community. Supporting infrastructure is incredibly important also here. It was when we talked real estate, when we talked about industrial or residential, you need people to be able to come to their homes at night without being delayed too much. The same goes for cargo. And when we see now due to land prices, manufacturing being pushed further and further away from the major cities, that is also presenting a challenge relative to bringing cargo efficiently and affordably to whether that be an airport or seaport. So those are some of the challenges that we, as a fast-growing manufacturing country, we're up against.
Let me add to that. I think obviously there's a real estate angle, right? So there's always land and licensing, right? But this is where we have a track record. So we've invested in real assets in Vietnam for many, many years, right? We've done energy business, right? Energy investment, real asset in Long An, a $3 billion project. We've done hospitality, right? We've done residential. So these are all kind of, to an extent, right, involve real estate and licensing. So I think that's where kind of the VinaCapital angle comes in. The other thing, so if you think sort of outside of real estate, then you've got the operating components, right? And this is where, Michael, which I think he probably hit it at the beginning of his talk, he's lived in Vietnam for 25 years. So he knows logistics in Vietnam, he knows the players, he knows the operators, et cetera, right? So that's why we bring the two expertise together. And I'll say probably, as with any private equity investment, right, always sort of our one eye is on the exit, right? So that's something that we have to think very carefully about to manage around that foreign ownership limit and how we structure the transaction as well.
Yeah, just quickly, those three sectors that we picked are not by accident. Those are actually pipeline deals that we're looking at. And Michael's absolutely right. There's a lot of factors in Vietnam that you can't control. But choosing those critical assets. So our strategy is finding the operational team, but also with a critical asset base. So location is incredibly important. The deals are hard to do, proprietary deals. And I think that's one of the things in this space you need to do proprietary deals. And we have the expertise to do it, and AP Moller's been doing that all across the world, and particularly in Vietnam.
Time is up. I can see we are actually 2 minutes past our allotted time. So unless there are any more questions, or we can later on be happy to entertain any questions. There's one, sorry.
Quick one. So in your current pipeline projects, are there any projects that you're looking for debt financings, fundings?
But I'm very glad you asked that, because that's part of that package that I'm building, right? So that top layer is financing. So because of the nature of this project, we think they are, or we believe they are very bankable, right? So yes, we do think about financing as part of that capital structure stack. So obviously very happy to chat more. But I think our time is up, so very happy to talk more kind of offline, outside, but yeah, do come find us.
Thank you very much.